Memoirs of Count Grammont, Volume 6, by Anthony Hamiltons. Edited with notes by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 10th. Other love intrigues at the English court. The conversation before related was agreeable only to Miss Hobart, for if Miss Temple was entertained with its commencement, she was so much the more irritated by its conclusion. This indignation was succeeded by the curiosity of knowing the reason why, if Sidney had a real esteem for her, she should not be allowed to pay some attention to him. As soon as they retired from the closet, Miss Sarah came out of the bath, where during all this conversation she had been almost perished with cold, without daring to complain. This little gypsy had it seems obtained leave of Miss Hobart's woman to bathe herself unknown to her mistress, and having I know not how found means to fill one of the baths with cold water, Miss Sarah had just got into it, when they were both alarmed with the arrival of the other two. A glass partition enclosed the room where the baths were, and Indian silk curtains which drew on the inside screened those that were bathing. Miss Hobart's chambermaid had only just time to draw these curtains that the girl might not be seen to lock the partition door, and to take away the key before her mistress and Miss Temple came in. These two sat down on a couch, placed along the partition, and Miss Sarah, notwithstanding her alarms, had distinctly heard, and perfectly retained the whole conversation. As the little girl was at all this trouble to make herself clean only on Lord Rochester's account, as soon as ever she could make her escape, she regained her garret, where Rochester, having repaired thither at the appointed hour, was fully informed of all that had passed in the bathing-room. He was astonished at the audacious temerity of Hobart in daring to put such a trick upon him, but though he rightly judged that love and jealousy were the real motives, he would not excuse her. Little Sarah desired to know whether he had a real affection for Miss Temple, as Miss Hobart said she supposed that was the case. "Can you doubt it?" replied he, "since that oracle of sincerity has affirmed it? But then you know that I am not now capable of profiting by my perfidy, were I even to gain Miss Temple's compliance, since my debauches and the streetwalkers have brought me to order." This answer made Miss Sarah very easy, for she concluded that the first article was not true, since she knew from experience that the latter was false. Lord Rochester was resolved that very evening to attend the Duchess Court, to see what reception he would meet with after the fine portrait Miss Hobart had been so kind as to draw of him. Miss Temple did not fail to be there, likewise with the intention of looking on him with the most contemptuous disdain possible, though she had taken care to dress herself as well as she could, as she supposed that the lampoon Miss Hobart had sung to her was in everybody's possession. She was under great embarrassment lest all those whom she met should think her such a monster as Lord Rochester had described her in. The meantime Miss Hobart, who had not much confidence in her promises never more to speak to him, narrowly watched her. Miss Temple never in her life appeared so handsome. Every person complimented her upon it, but she received all the civilities with such an air that every one thought she was mad, for when they commended her shape, her fresh complexion, and the brilliancy of her eyes, "Pshaw," said she, "it is very well known that I am but a monster, and formed in no respect like other women. All is not gold that glisters, and though I may receive some compliments in public, it signifies nothing." All Miss Hobart's endeavours to stop her tongue were ineffectual, and continuing to rail at herself ironically, the whole court was puzzled to comprehend her meaning. When Lord Rochester came in, she first blushed, then turned pale, made a motion to go towards him, drew back again, pulled her gloves one after the other up to the elbow, and after having 3 times violently flirted her fan, she waited until he paid his compliments to her as usual, and as soon as he began to bow, the fair one immediately turned her back upon him. Rochester only smiled, and being resolved that her resentment should be still more remarked, he turned round, and posting himself face to face, "Madam," said he, "nothing can be so glorious as to look so charming as you do, after such a fatiguing day, to support a ride of 3 long hours, and Miss Hobart afterwards, without being tired, shows, indeed, a very strong constitution." Miss Temple had naturally a tender look, but she was transported with such a violent passion at his having the audacity to speak to her that her eyes appeared like 2 fireballs when she turned them upon him. Hobart pinched her arm as she perceived that this look was likely to be followed by a torrent of reproaches and invectives. Lord Rochester did not wait for them, and delaying until another opportunity the acknowledgments he owed Miss Hobart, he quietly retired. The latter, who could not imagine that he knew anything of their conversation at the bath, was however much alarmed at what he had said, but Miss Temple almost choked with the reproaches with which she thought herself able to confound him, and which she had not time to give vent to, vowed to ease her mind of them upon the first opportunity, notwithstanding the promise she had made, but never more to speak to him afterwards. Lord Rochester had a faithful spy near these nymphs. This was Miss Sarah, who by his advice, and with her aunt's consent, was reconciled with Miss Hobart the more effectually to betray her. He was informed by this spy that Miss Hobart's maid, being suspected of having listened to them in the closet, had been turned away, that she had taken another, whom in all probability she would not keep long, because in the first place she was ugly, and in the second she eat the sweetmeats that were prepared for Miss Temple. Although this intelligence was not very material, Sarah was nevertheless praised for her punctuality and attention, and a few days afterwards she brought him news of real importance. Rochester was by her informed that Miss Hobart and her new favourite designed about 9 o'clock in the evening to walk in the mall in the park, that they were to change clothes with each other, to put on scarfs and wear black masks. She added that Miss Hobart had strongly opposed this project, but that she was obliged to give way at last, Miss Temple having resolved to indulge her fancy. Upon the strength of this intelligence, Rochester concerted his measures. He went to Killigrew, complained to him of the trick which Miss Hobart had played him, and desired his assistance in order to be revenged. This was readily granted, and having acquainted him with the measures he intended to pursue, and given him the part he was to act in this adventure, they went to the mall. Presently after appeared our 2 nymphs in masquerade. Their shapes were not very different, and their faces, which were very unlike each other, were concealed with their masks. The company was but thin in the park, and as soon as Miss Temple perceived them at a distance, she quickened her pace in order to join them with the design, under her disguise, severely to reprimand the perfidious Rochester, when Miss Hobart, stopping her, "Where are you running to?" said she. "Have you a mind to engage in conversation with these 2 devils, to be exposed to all the insolence and impertinence for which they are so notorious?" These remonstrances were entirely useless. Miss Temple was resolved to try the experiment, and all that could be obtained from her was not to answer any of the questions Rochester might ask her. They were accosted just as they had done speaking. Rochester fixed upon Hobart, pretending to take her for the other, at which she was overjoyed. But Miss Temple was extremely sorry. She fell to Killigrew's share, with whom she had nothing to do. He perceived her uneasiness, and pretending to know her by her clothes, "Ah, Miss Hobart," said he, "be so kind as look this way, if you please. I know not by what chance you both came hither, but I am sure it is very apropos for you, since I have something to say to you as your friend and humble servant." This beginning raising her curiosity, Miss Temple appeared more inclined to attend him, and Killigrew, perceiving that the other couple had insensibly proceeded some distance from them, "In the name of God," said he, "what do you mean by railing so against Lord Rochester, whom you know to be one of the most honourable men at court, and whom you nevertheless described as the greatest villain to the person whom of all others he esteems and respects the most? What do you think would become of you if he knew that you made Miss Temple believe she is the person alluded to in a certain song, which you know as well as myself was made upon the clumsy Miss Price above a year before the fair Temple was heard of? Be not surprised that I know so much of the matter, but pay a little attention, I pray you, to what I am now going to tell you. Out of pure friendship, your passion and inclinations for Miss Temple are known to everyone but herself, for whatever methods you used to impose upon her innocence, the world does her the justice to believe that she would treat you as Lady Falmouth did, if the poor girl knew the wicked designs you had upon her. I caution you therefore against making any farther advances to a person too modest to listen to them. I advise you likewise to take back your maid again, in order to silence her scandalous tongue, for she says everywhere that she is with child, that you are the occasion of her being in that condition, and accuses you of behaving towards her with the blackest ingratitude upon trifling suspicions. Only you know very well these are no stories of my own invention, but that you may not entertain any manner of doubt that I had all this from her own mouth, she has told me your conversation in the bathing-room, the characters you there drew of the principal men at court, your artful malice in applying so improperly a scandalous song to one of the loveliest women in all England, and in what manner the innocent girl fell into the snare you had laid for her in order to do justice to her charms. But that which might be of the most fatal consequences to you in that long conversation is the revealing certain secrets which in all probability the Duchess did not entrust you with to be imparted to the maids of honour. Reflect upon this, and neglect not to make some reparation to Sir Littleton for the ridicule with which you were pleased to load him. I know not whether he had his information from your femidet chamber, but I am very certain that he has sworn he will be revenged, and he is a man that keeps his word. For after all, that you may not be deceived by his look, like that of a stoic, and his gravity like that of a judge, I must acquaint you that he is the most passionate man living. Indeed, these invectives are of the blackest and most horrible nature. He says it is most infamous that a wretch like yourself should find no other employment than to blacken the characters of gentlemen to gratify your jealousy, that if you do not desist from such conduct for the future he will immediately complain of you, and that if Her Royal Highness will not do him justice, he is determined to do himself justice, and to run you through the body with his own sword, though you were even in the arms of Miss Temple, and that it is most scandalous that all the maids of honour should get into your hands before they can look around them. These things, madam, I thought it my duty to acquaint you with. You are better able to judge than myself whether what I have now advanced be true, and I leave it to your own discretion to make what use you think proper of my advice. But were I in your situation, I would endeavour to reconcile Lord Rochester and Miss Temple once more. I recommend to you to take care that your endeavours to mislead her innocency, in order to blast his honour, may not come to his knowledge, and do not estrange from her a man who tenderly loves her, and whose probity is so great that he would not even suffer his eyes to wander towards her, if his intention was not to make her his wife. Miss Temple observed her promise most faithfully during this discourse. She did not even utter a single syllable, being seized with such astonishment and confusion that she quite lost the use of her tongue. Miss Hobart and Lord Rochester came up to her while she was still in amazement at the wonderful discoveries she had made, things in themselves, in her opinion, almost incredible, but to the truth of which she could not refuse her assent. Upon examining the evidences and circumstances on which they were founded, never was confusion equal to that with which her whole frame was seized by the foregoing recital. Rochester and Killigrew took leave of them before she recovered from her surprise, but as soon as she had regained the free use of her senses, she hastened back to St. James, without answering a single question that the other put to her, and having locked herself up in her chamber, the first thing she did was immediately to strip off Miss Hobart's clothes, lest she should be contaminated by them, for after what she had been told concerning her, she looked upon her as a monster dreadful to the innocence of the fair sex, of whatever sex she might be. She blushed at the familiarities she had been drawn into with a creature whose maid was with child, though she never had been in any other service. But her she therefore returned her all her clothes, ordered her servant to bring back all her own, and resolved never more to have any connection with her. Miss Hobart, on the other hand, who supposed Killigrew had mistaken Miss Temple for herself, could not comprehend what could induce her to give herself such surprising airs since that conversation, but being desirous to come to an explanation, she ordered Miss Temple's maid to remain in her apartments, and went to call upon Miss Temple herself, instead of sending back her clothes, and being desirous to give her some proof of friendship before they entered upon expostulations, she slipped softly into her chamber when she was in the very act of changing her linen, and embraced her. Miss Temple, finding herself in her arms, before she had taken notice of her, everything that Killigrew had mentioned appeared to her imagination. She fancied that she saw in her looks the eagerness of a satyr, or if possible of some monster still more odious, and disengaging herself with the highest indignation from her arms, she began to shriek and cry in the most terrible manner, calling both heaven and earth to her assistance. The first whom her cries raised were the governess and her niece. It was near 12 o'clock at night. Miss Temple, in her shift, almost frightened to death, was pushing back with horror Miss Hobart, who approached her with no other intent than to know the occasion of those transports. As soon as the governess saw this scene, she began to lecture Miss Hobart with all the eloquence of a real duenna. She demanded of her whether she thought it was for her that Her Royal Highness kept the maids of honour, whether she was not ashamed to come at such an unseasonable time of night into their very apartments to commit such violences, and swore that she would the very next day complain to the Duchess. All this confirmed Miss Temple in her mistaken notions, and Hobart was obliged to go away at last, without being able to convince or bring to reason creatures whom she believed to be either distracted or mad. The next day Miss Sarah did not fail to relate this adventure to her lover, telling him how Miss Temple's cries had alarmed the maids of honour's apartment, and how herself and her aunt, running to her assistance, had almost surprised Miss Hobart in the very act. 2 days after the whole adventure, with the addition of several embellishments, was made public, the governess swore to the truth of it, and related in every company what a narrow escape Miss Temple had experienced, and that Miss Sarah, her niece, had preserved her honour, because by Lord Rochester's excellent advice she had forbidden her all manner of connection with so dangerous a person. Miss Temple was afterwards informed that the song that had so greatly provoked her alluded to Miss Price. Only this was confirmed to her by every person, with additional execrations against Miss Hobart, for such a scandalous imposition. Such great coldness, after so much familiarity, made many believe that this adventure was not altogether a fiction. This had been sufficient to have disgraced Miss Hobart at court, and to have totally ruined her reputation in London, had she not been upon the present as well as upon a former occasion, supported by the Duchess. Her Royal Highness pretended to treat the whole story as romantic and visionary, or as solely arising from private pique. She chid Miss Temple for her impertinent credulity, turned away the governess, and her niece for the lies with which she pretended they supported the imposture, and did many improper things in order to re-establish Miss Hobart's honour, which however she failed in accomplishing, she had her reasons for not entirely abandoning her, as will appear in the sequel. Miss Temple, who continually reproached herself with injustice with respect to Lord Rochester, and who upon the faith of Killigrew's word thought him the most honourable man in England, was only solicitous to find out some opportunity of easing her mind by making him some reparation for the rigour with which she had treated him. These favourable dispositions, in the hands of a man of his character, might have led to consequences of which she was not aware, but Heaven did not allow him an opportunity of profiting by them. Ever since he had first appeared at court he seldom failed being banished from it, at least once in the year, for whenever a word presented itself to his pen, or to his tongue, he immediately committed it to paper or produced it, in conversation without any manner of regard to the consequences. The ministers, the mistresses, and even the king himself, were frequently the subjects of his sarcasms, and had not the prince whom he thus treated been possessed of one of the most forgiving and gentle tempers, his first disgrace had certainly been his last. Just at the time that Miss Temple was desirous of seeing him in order to apologize for the uneasiness which the infamous calumnies and black aspersions of Miss Hobart had occasioned both of them, he was forbid the court for the third time. He departed without having seen Miss Temple, carried the disgraced governess down with him to his country seat, and exerted all his endeavours to cultivate in her niece some dispositions which she had for the stage, but though she did not make the same improvement in this line as she had by his other instructions, after he had entertained both the niece and the aunt for some months in the country, he got her entered in the King's company of comedians the next winter, and the public was obliged to him for the prettiest, but at the same time the worst actress in the kingdom. Though no name is given to this lady, there are circumstances enough mentioned to fix on the celebrated Mrs. Barry as the person intended by the author. Mrs. Barry was introduced to the stage by Lord Rochester, with whom she had an intrigue, the fruit of which was a daughter who lived to the age of 13 years, and is often mentioned in his collection of love letters printed in his works, which were written to Mrs. Barry on her first theatrical attempts. So little hopes were entertained of her, that she was, as Cibber declares, discharged the company at the end of the first year among others, that were thought to be a useless expense to it. She was well born, being daughter of Robert Barry, Esq. barrister at law, a gentleman of an ancient family and good estate, who hurt his fortune by his attachment to Charles Roman I, for whom he raised a regiment at his own expense. Tony Aston, in his supplement to Cibber's Apology, says she was woman to Lady Shelton of Norfolk, who might have belonged to the court curl. However, says she was early taken under the patronage of Lady Davenant. Both these accounts may be true. The time of her appearance on the stage was probably not much earlier, that 1671, in which year she performed in Tom Essence, and was, it may be conjectured, about the age of 19. Curll mentions the great pains taken by Lord Rochester in instructing her, which were repaid by the rapid progress she daily made in her profession. She at last eclipsed all her competitors, and in the part of Monimia established her reputation from her performance in this character, in that of Belvidera, and of Isabella in the Fatal Marriage Downs. Says, she acquired the name of the famous Mrs. Barry both at court and in the city. Mrs. Barry, says Dryden in his preface to Cleomenes, always excellent, has in this tragedy excelled herself and gained a reputation beyond any woman I have ever seen on the theatre in characters of greatness. Says Cibber, Mrs. Barry had a presence of elevated dignity, her mien and motion superb, and gracefully majestic, her voice full, clear, and strong, so that no violence of passion could be too much for her, and when distress or tenderness possessed her she subsided into the most affecting melody and softness. In the art of exciting pity, she had a power beyond all the actresses I have yet seen, or what your imagination can conceive. In scenes of anger, defiance, or resentment, while she was impetuous and terrible, she poured out the sentiment with an enchanting harmony, and it was this particular excellence for which Dryden made her the above recited compliment upon her acting Cassandra in his Cleomenes. She was the first person whose merit was distinguished by the indulgence of having an annual benefit play, which was granted to her alone in King James's time, and which did not become common to others till the division of this company after the death of King William and Queen Mary. About this time Talbot returned from Ireland. He soon felt the absence of Miss Hamilton, who was then in the country with a relation whom we shall mention hereafter. A remnant of his former tenderness still subsisted in his heart, notwithstanding his absence, and the promises he had given the Chevalier de Grammont at parting. He now therefore endeavoured to banish her entirely from his thoughts by fixing his desires upon some other object, but he saw no one in the Queen's new court whom he thought worthy of his attention. Miss Boynton, however, thought him worthy of hers. Her person was slender and delicate, to which a good complexion and large motionless eyes gave at a distance an appearance of beauty that vanished upon nearer inspection. She affected to lisp, to languish, and to have 2 or 3 fainting fits a day. The first time that Talbot cast his eyes upon her she was seized with one of these fits. He was told that she swooned away upon his account. He believed it was eager to afford her assistance, and ever after that accident showed her some kindness, more with the intention of saving her life than to express any affection he felt for her. This seeming tenderness was well received, and at first she was visibly affected by it. Talbot was one of the tallest men in England, and in all appearance one of the most robust, yet she showed sufficiently that she was willing to expose the delicacy of her constitution to whatever might happen in order to become his wife, which event perhaps might then have taken place, as it did afterwards, had not the charms of the fair Jennings at that time proved an obstacle to her wishes. I know not how it came to pass that he had not yet seen her, though he had heard her much praised, and her prudence, wit, and vivacity equally commended. He believed all this upon the faith of common report. He thought it very singular that discretion and sprightliness should be so intimately united in a person so young, more particularly in the midst of a court where love and gallantry were so much in fashion. But he found her personal accomplishments greatly to exceed whatever fame had reported of them. As it was not long before he perceived he was in love, neither was it long before he made a declaration of it. As his passion was likely enough to be real, Miss Jennings thought she might believe him without exposing herself to the imputation of vanity. Talbot was possessed of a fine and brilliant exterior. His manners were noble and majestic. Besides this, he was particularly distinguished by the favour and friendship of the Duke. But his most essential merit with her was his £40,000 a year landed property, besides his employments. All these qualities came within the rules and maxims she had resolved to follow with respect to lovers. Thus, though he had not the satisfaction to obtain from her an entire declaration of her sentiments, he had at least the pleasure of being better received than those who had paid their addresses to her before him. No person attempted to interrupt his happiness, and Miss Jennings, perceiving that the Duchess approved of Talbot's pretensions, and after having well weighed the matter, and consulted her own inclinations, found that her reason was more favourable to him than her heart, and that the most she could do for his satisfaction was to marry him without reluctance. Talbot, too, fortunate in a preference which no man had before experienced, did not examine whether it was to her heart or to her head that he was indebted for it, and his thoughts were solely occupied in hastening the accomplishment of his wishes. One would have sworn that the happy minute was at hand, but love would no longer be love if he did not delight in obstructing or in overturning the happiness of those who live under his dominion. Talbot, who found nothing reprehensible either in the person in the conversation or in the reputation of Miss Jennings, was however rather concerned at a now acquaintance she had lately formed, and having taken upon him to give her some cautions upon this subject, she was much displeased at his conduct. Miss Price, formerly maid of honour that had been set aside, as we have before mentioned, upon her leaving the Duchess' service, had recourse to Lady Castlemaine's protection. She had a very entertaining wit. Her complaisance was adapted to all humours, and her own humour was possessed of a fund of gaiety and sprightliness, which diffused universal mirth and merriment. Wherever she came, her acquaintance with Miss Jennings was prior to Talbot's. As she was thoroughly acquainted with all the intrigues of the court, she related them without any manner of reserve to Miss Jennings, and her own with the same frankness as the others. Miss Jennings was extremely well pleased with her stories, for though she was determined to make no experiment in love, but upon honourable terms, she however was desirous of knowing from her recitals all the different intrigues that were carrying on. Thus, as she was never wearied with her conversation, she was overjoyed whenever she could see her. Talbot, who remarked the extreme relish she had for Miss Price's company, thought that the reputation such a woman had in the world might prove injurious to his mistress, more especially from the particular intimacy there seemed to exist between them, whereupon, in the tone of a guardian rather than a lover, he took upon him to chide her for the disreputable company she kept. Miss Jennings was haughty beyond conception when once she took it into her head, and as she liked Miss Price's conversation much better than Talbot's, she took the liberty of desiring him to attend to his own affairs, and that if he only came from Ireland to read lectures about her conduct, he might take the trouble to go back as soon as he pleased. He was offended at a sally, which he thought ill-timed considering the situation of affairs between them, and went out of her presence more abruptly than became the respect due from a man greatly in love. He for some time appeared offended, but perceiving that he gained nothing by such conduct, he grew weary of acting that part, and assumed that of an humble lover in which he was equally unsuccessful. Neither his repentance nor submissions could produce any effect upon her, and the mutinous little gypsy was still in her pouts when Jermyn returned to court. It was above a year since he had triumphed over the weakness of Lady Castlemaine, and above 2 since the king had been weary of his triumphs. His uncle, being vile of the first, who perceived the king's disgust, obliged him to absent himself from court at the very time that orders were going to be issued for that purpose. For though the king's affections for Lady Castlemaine were now greatly diminished, yet he did not think it consistent with his dignity that a mistress whom he had honoured with public distinction, and who still received a considerable support from him, should appear chained to the car of the most ridiculous conqueror that ever existed. His Majesty had frequently expostulated with the Countess upon this subject, but his expostulations were never attended to. It was in one of these differences that he, advising her rather to bestow her favours upon Jacob Hall the rope dancer, who was able to return them, than lavish away her money upon Jermyn to no purpose, since it would be more honourable for her to pass for the mistress of the first than for the very humble servant of the other. She was not proof against his raillery. The impetuosity of her temper broke forth like lightning. She told him that it very ill became him to throw out such reproaches against one who, of all the women in England, deserved them the least, that he had never ceased quarrelling thus unjustly with her ever since he had betrayed his own mean low inclinations, that to gratify such a depraved taste as his he wanted only such silly things as Stuart Wells, and that pitiful strolling actress probably Nell Gwyn, whom he had lately introduced into their society. Floods of tears from rage generally attended these storms, after which, resuming the part of Medea, the scene closed with menaces of tearing her children in pieces, and setting his palace on fire. What course could he pursue with such an outrageous fury, who, beautiful as she was, resembled Medea less than her dragons when she was thus enraged? The indulgent monarch loved peace, and as he seldom contended for it on these occasions without paying something to obtain it, he was obliged to be at great expense in order to reconcile this last rupture, as they could not agree of themselves, and both parties equally complained. The Chevalier de Grammont was chosen by mutual consent mediator of the treaty. The grievances and pretensions on each side were communicated to him, and what is very extraordinary, he managed so as to please them both. Here follow the articles of peace which they agreed to: that Lady Castlemaine should for ever abandon Jermyn, that as a proof of her sincerity and the reality of his disgrace, she should consent to his being sent for some time into the country, that she should not rail any more against Miss Wells, nor storm any more against Miss Stuart, and this without any restraint on the king's behaviour towards her, that in consideration of these condescensions, his Majesty should immediately give her the title of Duchess, with all the honours and privileges thereunto belonging, and an addition to her pension, in order to enable her to support the dignity. The title of Duchess of Cleveland was conferred on her 3rd August 22, Charles Roman II, 1670. As soon as this peace was proclaimed, the political critics, who in all nations never fail to censure all state proceedings, pretended that the mediator of this treaty, being every day at play with Lady Castlemaine, and never losing, had for his own sake insisted a little too strongly upon this last article. Some days after she was created Duchess of Cleveland, and little Jermyn repaired to his countrysat. However, it was in his power to have returned in a fortnight, for the Chevalier de Grammont, having procured the king's permission, carried it to the Earl of St. Albans. This revived the good old man, but it was to little purpose. He transmitted it to his nephew, for whether he wished to make the London beauties deplore and lament his absence, or whether he wished them to declaim against the injustice of the age, or rail against the tyranny of the prince, he continued above half a year in the country, setting up for a little philosopher under the eyes of the sportsmen in the neighbourhood, who regarded him as an extraordinary instance of the caprice of fortune. He thought the part he acted so glorious that he would have continued there much longer had he not heard of Miss Jennings. He did not, however, pay much attention to what his friends wrote to him concerning her charms, being persuaded he had seen equally as great in others. What was related to him of her pride and resistance appeared to him of far greater consequence, and to subdue the last he even looked upon as an action worthy of his prowess, and quitting his retreat for this purpose, he arrived in London at the time that Talbot, who was really in love, had quarrelled in his opinion so unjustly with Miss Jennings. She had heard Jermyn spoken of as a hero in affairs of love and gallantry. Miss Price, in the recital of those of the Duchess of Cleveland, had often mentioned him without in any respect diminishing the insignificancy with which fame insinuated he had conducted himself in those amorous encounters. She nevertheless had the greatest curiosity to see a man whose entire person, she thought, must be a moving trophy and monument of the favours and freedoms of the fair sex. Thus Jermyn arrived at the right time to satisfy her curiosity by his presence, and though his brilliancy appeared a little tarnished by his residence in the country, though his head was larger, and his legs more slender than usual, yet the giddy girl thought she had never seen any man so perfect and yielding to her destiny. She fell in love with him 1,000 times more unaccountably than all the others had done before her. Everybody remarked this change of conduct in her with surprise, for they expected something more from the delicacy of a person who, till this time, had behaved with so much propriety in all her actions. Jermyn was not in the least surprised at this conquest, though not a little proud of it, for his heart had very soon as great a share in it as his vanity. Talbot, who saw with amazement the rapidity of this triumph, and the disgrace of his own defeat, was ready to die with jealousy and spite, yet he thought it would be more to his credit to die than to vent those passions unprofitably, and shielding himself under a feigned indifference, he kept at a distance to view how far such an extravagant prepossession would proceed. In the meantime Jermyn quietly enjoyed the happiness of seeing the inclinations of the prettiest and most extraordinary creature in England, declared in his favour the Duchess, who had taken her under her protection ever since she had declined placing herself under that of the Duke. Sounded Jermyn's intentions towards her, and was satisfied with the assurances she received from a man whose probity infinitely exceeded his merit in love. He therefore let all the court see that he was willing to marry her, though at the same time he did not appear particularly desirous of hastening the consummation. Every person now complimented Miss Jennings upon having reduced to this situation the terror of husbands and the plague of lovers. The court was in full expectation of this miracle, and Miss Jennings of a near approaching happy settlement. But in this world one must have fortune in one's favour before one can calculate with certainty upon happiness. The king did not use to let Lord Rochester remain so long in exile. He grew weary of it, and being displeased that he was forgotten, he posted up to London to wait till it might be his Majesty's pleasure to recall him. He first took up his habitation in the city among the capital tradesmen and rich merchants, where politeness indeed is not so much cultivated as at court, but where pleasure, luxury, and abundance reign with less confusion and more sincerity. His first design was only to be initiated into the mysteries of those fortunate and happy inhabitants, that is to say, by changing his name and dress to gain admittance to their feasts and entertainments, and as occasion offered to those of their loving spouses. As he was able to adapt himself to all capacities and humours, he soon deeply insinuated himself into the esteem of the substantial wealthy aldermen, and into the affections of their more delicate, magnificent, and tender ladies. He made one in all their feasts and at all their assemblies, and whilst in the company of the husbands he declaimed against the faults and mistakes of government, he joined their wives in railing against the profligacy of the court ladies, and in inveighing against the king's mistresses. He agreed with them that the industrious poor were to pay for these cursed extravagances, that the city beauties were not inferior to those of the other end of the town, and yet a sober husband in this quarter of the town was satisfied with one wife, after which, to outdo their murmurings, he said that he wondered Whitehall was not yet consumed by fire from heaven, since such rakes as Rochester, Killigrew, and Sidney were suffered there, who had the impudence to assert that all married men in the city were cuckolds, and all their wives painted. This conduct endeared him so much to the cits, and made him so welcome at their clubs, that at last he grew sick of their cramming and endless invitations. But instead of approaching nearer the court, he retreated into one of the most obscure corners of the city, where again, changing both his name and his dress, in order to act a new part, he caused bills to be dispersed giving notice of the recent arrival of a famous German doctor, who by long application and experience had found out wonderful secrets and infallible remedies. Bishop Burnet confirms this account. Being under an unlucky accident which obliged him to keep out of the way, he disguised himself so that his nearest friends could not have known him, and set up in Tower Street for an Italian mountebank, where he practised physic for some weeks, not without success in his latter years. He read books of history more. He took pleasure to disguise himself as a porter or as a beggar, sometimes to follow some mean amours, which for the variety of them he affected at other times merely for diversion. He would go about in odd shapes, in which he acted his part so naturally, that even those who were in the secret, and saw him in these shapes, could perceive nothing by which he might be discovered. Burnet's Life of Rochester, ed. 1774, p. 14. His secrets consisted in knowing what was past, and foretelling what was to come by the assistance of astrology, and the virtue of his remedies principally consisted in giving present relief to unfortunate young women in all manner of diseases, and all kinds of accidents incident to the fair sex, either from too unbounded charity to their neighbours, or too great indulgence to themselves. His first practice being confined to his neighbourhood was not very considerable, but his reputation soon extending to the other end of the town, there presently flocked to him the women attending on the court, next the chambermaids of ladies of quality, who upon the wonders they related concerning the German doctor, were soon followed by some of their mistresses. Among all the compositions of a ludicrous and satirical kind, there never existed any that could be compared to those of Lord Rochester, either for humour, fire, or wit. But of all his works the most ingenious and entertaining is that which contains a detail of the intrigues and adventures in which he was engaged, while he professed medicine and astrology in the suburbs of London. The fair Jennings was very near getting a place in this collection, but the adventure that prevented her from it did not, however, conceal from the public her intention of paying a visit to the German doctor. The first chambermaids that consulted him were only those of the maids of honour who had numberless questions to ask, and not a few doubts to be resolved both upon their own and their mistresses' accounts. Notwithstanding their disguise, he recognized some of them, particularly Miss Temple's and Miss Price's maids, and her whom Miss Hobart had lately discarded. These creatures all returned either filled with wonder and amazement, or petrified with terror and fear. Miss Temple's chambermaid deposed that he assured her she would have the smallpox, and her mistress the great within 2 months at farthest if her aforesaid mistress did not guard against a man in woman's clothes. Miss Price's woman affirmed that without knowing her, and only looking in her hand, he told her at first sight that according to the course of the stars, he perceived that she was in the service of some good-natured lady who had no other fault than loving wine and men. In short, every one of them struck with some particular circumstance relating to their own private affairs, had either alarmed or diverted their mistresses, with the account not failing according to custom to embellish the truth in order to enhance the wonder. Miss Price relating these circumstances one day to her new friend, the devil immediately tempted her to go in person, and see what sort of a creature this new magician was. This enterprise was certainly very rash, but nothing was too rash for Miss Jennings, who was of opinion that a woman might despise appearances provided she was in reality virtuous. Miss Price was all compliance, and thus having fixed upon this glorious resolution, they only thought of the proper means of putting it into execution. It was very difficult for Miss Jennings to disguise herself on account of her excessive fair and bright complexion, and of something particular in her air and manner. However, after having well considered the matter, the best disguise they could think of was to dress themselves like orange girls. These frolics appear to have been not unfrequent with persons of high rank at this period. In a letter from Mr. Henshaw to Sir Robert Paston, afterwards Earl of Yarmouth, dated October 13, 1670, we have the following account: last week, there being a fair near Audlane, the Queen, the Duchess of Richmond, and the Duchess of Buckingham had a frolic to disguise themselves like country lasses to red petticoats, waistcoats, Roman 100, and so go see the fair Sir Barnard Gascoigne on a cart Jade Road, before the Queen another stranger, before the Duchess of Buckingham and Mr. Roper before Richmond. They had all so overdone it in their disguise, and looked so much more like antiques than country folk, that as soon as they came to the fair, the people began to go after them, but the Queen going to a booth to buy a pair of yellow stockings for her sweetheart, and Sir Bernard asking for a pair of gloves sticked with blue for his sweetheart, they were soon by their gibberish found to be strangers, which drew a bigger flock about them. One amongst them had seen the Queen at dinner, knew her, and was proud of her knowledge. This soon brought all the fair into a crowd to stare at the Queen. Being thus discovered, they as soon as they could got to their horses, but as many of the fair as had horses got up with their wives, children, sweethearts, or neighbours behind them, to get as much gape as they could till they brought them to the court gate. Thus by ill conduct was a merry frolic turned into a penance. Ives Select Papers, p. 39. Bishop Burnet says at this time, 1668, the court fell into much extravagance in masquerading both the king and queen. All the court went about masked, and came into houses unknown, and danced there with a great deal of wild frolic, In all this people were so disguised that without being in the secret none could distinguish them. They were carried about in hackney chairs, once the Queen's chairman not knowing who she was went from her, so she was alone, and was much disturbed, and came to Whitehall in a hackney coach, some say, in a cart. Burnet's History, Vol. Roman 1 p. 368. This was no sooner resolved upon, but it was put in execution. They attired themselves alike, and taking each a basket of oranges under their arms, they embarked in a hackney coach, and committed themselves to fortune without any other escort than their own caprice and indiscretion. The Duchess was gone to the play with her sister. Miss Jennings had excused herself under pretence of indisposition. She was overjoyed at the happy commencement of their adventure, for they had disguised themselves, had crossed the park, and taken their hackney coach at Whitehall gate without the least accident. They mutually congratulated each other upon it, and Miss Price, taking a beginning so prosperous as a good omen of their success, asked her companion what they were to do at the fortunateller's, and what they should propose to him. Miss Jennings told her that for her part curiosity was her principal inducement for going thither, that however she was resolved to ask him, without naming any person, why a man who was in love with a handsome young lady was not urgent to marry her, since this was in his power to do, and by so doing he would have an opportunity of gratifying his desires. Miss Price told her, smiling, that without going to the astrologer nothing was more easy than to explain the enigma, as she herself had almost given her a solution of it in the narrative of the Duchess of Cleveland's adventures. Having by this time nearly arrived at the playhouse, Miss Price, after a moment's reflection, said that since fortune favoured them, a fair opportunity was now offered to signalise their courage, which was to go and sell oranges in the very playhouse in the sight of the Duchess and the whole court. The proposal being worthy of the sentiments of the one and of the vivacity of the other, they immediately alighted, paid off their hack, and running through the midst of an immense number of coaches with great difficulty, they reached the playhouse door. Sidney, more handsome than the beautiful Adonis, and dressed more gay than usual, alighted. Just then from his coach, Miss Price went boldly up to him as he was adjusting his curls, but he was too much occupied with his own dear self to attend to anything else, and so passed on without deigning to give her an answer. Killigrew came next, and the fair Jennings, partly encouraged by the other's pertness, advanced towards him, and offered him her basket, whilst Price, more used to the language, desired him to buy her fine oranges. Not now, said he, looking at them with attention, but if thou wilt tomorrow morning bring this young girl to my lodgings, I will make it worth all the oranges in London to thee. And while he thus spoke to the one, he chucked the other under the chin, examining her bosom, these familiarities making little Jennings forget the part she was acting. After having pushed him away with all the violence she was able, she told him with indignation that it was very insolent to dare. Said he, here's a rarity indeed, a young W, who the better to sell her goods, sets up for virtue, and pretends innocence. Price immediately perceived that nothing could be gained by continuing any longer in so dangerous a place, and taking her companion under the arm, she dragged her away, while she was still in emotion at the insult that had been offered to her. Miss Jennings, resolving to sell no more oranges on these terms, was tempted to return without accomplishing the other adventure, but Price, having represented to her the disgrace of such cowardly behaviour, more particularly, after having before manifested so much resolution, she consented to go and pay the astrologer a short visit, so as they might be enabled to regain the palace before the play was ended. They had one of the doctor's bills for a direction, but there was no occasion for it, for the driver of the coach they had taken told them he knew very well the place they wanted, for he had already carried above 100 persons to the German doctor's. They were within half a street of his house, when fortune thought proper to play them a trick. Brouncker had dined by chance with a merchant in that part of the city, and just as he was going away they ordered their coach to stop, as luck would have it just opposite to him 2 orange girls in a hackney coach, one of whom appeared to have a very pretty face, immediately drew his attention. Besides, he had a natural curiosity for such objects. Gentleman of the Chamber to the Duke of York, and brother to Lord Viscount Brouncker, President of the Royal Society, Lord Clarendon imputes to him the cause of the great sea fight in 1665, not being so well improved as it might have been, and adds, nor did the Duke come to hear of it till some years after, when Mr. Brounker's ill course of life and his abominable nature had rendered him so odious that it was taken notice of in Parliament, and upon examination found to be true, as is here related, upon which he was expelled the House of Commons, whereof he was a member, as an infamous person, though his friend Coventry adhered to him, and used many indirect acts to have protected him, and afterwards procured him to have more countenance from the king, than most men thought, he deserved being a person, throughout his whole life never notorious for anything but the highest degree of impudence and stooping to the most infamous offices, and playing very well at chess, which preferred him more than the most virtuous qualities could have done. Continuation of Clarendon's life p. 270. Of all the men at court, he had the least regard for the fair sex, and the least attention to their reputation. He was not young, nor was his person agreeable. However, with a great deal of wit, he had a violent passion for women. He did himself justice, respecting his own merit, and being persuaded that he could only succeed with those who were desirous of having his money, he was at open war with all the rest. He had a little country house 4 or 5 miles from London, always well stocked with girls. In other respects, he was a very honest man and the best chess player in England. Price, alarmed at being thus closely examined by the most dangerous enemy they could encounter, turned her head the other way, bid her companion do the same, and told the coachman to drive on. Brownker followed them unperceived on foot, and the coach having stopped 20 or 30 yards farther up the street, they alighted. He was just behind them, and formed the same judgment of them, which a man much more charitable to the sex must unavoidably have done, concluding that Miss Jennings was a young courtesan upon the lookout, and that Miss Price was the mother rabbess. He was, however, surprised to see them have much better shoes and stockings than women of that rank generally wear, and that the little orange girl, in getting out of a very high coach, showed one of the handsomest legs he had ever seen. But as all this was no obstruction to his designs, he resolved to purchase her at any rate in order to place her in his seraglio. He came up to them as they were giving their baskets in guard to the coachman, with orders to wait for them exactly in that place. Brownker immediately pushed in between them. As soon as they saw him, they gave themselves up for lost, but he, without taking the least notice of their surprise, took Price aside with one hand and his purse with the other, and began immediately to enter upon business, but was astonished to perceive that she turned away her face without either answering or looking at him. As this conduct appeared to him unnatural, he stared her full in the face. Notwithstanding all her endeavours to prevent him, he did the same to the other, and immediately recognized them, but determined to conceal his discovery. The old fox possessed a wonderful command of temper on such occasions, and having teased them a little longer to remove all suspicions, he quitted them, telling Price that she was a great fool to refuse his offers, and that her girl would not perhaps get so much in a year as she might with him in one day, that the times were greatly changed, since the queens and the duchess maids of honour forestalled the market, and were to be had cheaper than the town ladies. Upon this, he went back to his coach, whilst they blessed themselves, returning heaven their most hearty thanks for having escaped this danger without being discovered. Brownker, on the other hand, would not have taken 1,000 guineas for this rencounter. He blessed the Lord that he had not alarmed them to such a degree as to frustrate their intention, for he made no doubt but Miss Price had managed some intrigue for Miss Jennings. He therefore immediately concluded that at present it would be improper to make known his discovery, which would have answered no other end but to have overwhelmed them with confusion. Upon this account, although Jermyn was one of his best friends, he felt a secret joy in not having prevented his being made a cuckold before his marriage, and the apprehension he was in of preserving him from that accident was his sole reason for quitting them with the precautions aforementioned. Whilst they were under these alarms, their coachman was engaged in a squabble with some blackguard boys, who had gathered round his coach in order to steal the oranges from Words. They came to blows. The two nymphs saw the commencement of the fray as they were returning to the coach, after having abandoned the design of going to the fortune-tellers. Their coachman being a man of spirit, it was with great difficulty they could persuade him to leave their oranges to the mob, that they might get off without any further disturbance, having thus regained their hack after 1,000 frights, and after having received an abundant share of the most low and infamous abuse applied to them during the fracas, they at length reached St. James, vowing never more to go after fortune-tellers through so many dangers, terrors, and alarms as they had lately undergone. Brownker, who from the indifferent opinion he entertained of the fair sex would have staked his life that Miss Jennings did not return from this expedition in the same condition she went, kept his thoughts, however, a profound secret, since it would have afforded him the highest satisfaction to have seen the all-fortunate Jermyn marry a little street-walker who pretended to pass for a pattern of chastity, that he might the day after his marriage congratulate him upon his virtuous spouse. But heaven was not disposed to afford him that satisfaction, as will appear in the sequel of these memoirs. Miss Hamilton was in the country, as we before mentioned, at a relation's. The Chevalier de Grammont bore this short absence of hers with great uneasiness, since she would not allow him permission to visit her there, upon any pretence whatever. But play which was favourable to him was no small relief to his extreme impatience. Miss Hamilton, however, at last returned Mrs. Wetenhall, for that was the name of her relation, would by all means wait upon her to London, in appearance out of politeness, for ceremony carried, beyond all bearing, is the grand characteristic of country gentry. Yet this mark of civility was only a pretence to obtain a peevish husband's consent to his wife's journey. To town, perhaps, he would have done himself the honour of conducting Miss Hamilton up to London, had he not been employed in writing some remarks upon the ecclesiastical history, a work in which he had long been engaged. The ladies were more civil than to interrupt him in his undertaking, and besides it would entirely have disconcerted all Mrs. Wetenhall's schemes. This lady was what may be properly called a beauty entirely English, made up of lilies and roses, of snow and milk, as to colour, and of wax with respect to the arms, hands, neck and feet. But all this without either animation or air. Her face was uncommonly pretty, but there was no variety, no change of countenance in it. One would have thought she took it in the morning out of a case, in order to put it up again at night, without using it in the smallest degree in the daytime. What can I say of her nature had formed her a baby from her infancy, and a baby remained, till death. The fair Mrs. Wetenhall, her husband, had been destined for the church, but his elder brother dying just at the time he had gone through his studies of divinity, instead of taking orders, he came to England, and took to wife Miss Bedingfield, the lady of whom we are now speaking. His person was not disagreeable, but he had a serious contemplative air very apt to occasion disgust. As for the rest, she might boast of having one of the greatest theologists in the kingdom for her husband. He was all day poring over his books, and went to bed soon in order to rise early, so that his wife found him snoring when she came to bed, and when he arose he left her there sound asleep. His conversation at table would have been very brisk if Mrs. Wetenhall had been as great a proficient in divinity, or as great a lover of controversy, as he was, but being neither learned in the former nor desirous of the latter, silence reigned at their table, as absolutely as at a refectory. She had often expressed a great desire to see London, but though they were only distant a very short day's journey from it, she had never been able to satisfy her curiosity. It was not therefore without reason that she grew weary of the life she was forced to lead at Peckham. The melancholy retired situation of the place was to her insupportable, and as she had the folly incident to many other women of believing sterility to be a kind of reproach, she was very much hurt to see that she might fall under that suspicion, for she was persuaded that, although heaven had denied her children, she nevertheless had all the necessary requisites on her part. If it had been the will of the Lord, this had occasioned her to make some reflections, and then to reason upon those reflections, as for instance that since her husband chose rather to devote himself to his studies than to the duties of matrimony, to turn over musty old books rather than attend to the attractions of beauty, and to gratify his own pleasures rather than those of his wife, it might be permitted her to relieve some necessitous lover in neighbourly charity, provided she could do it conscientiously, and to direct her inclinations in so just a manner that the evil spirit should have no concern in it. Mr. Wetenhall, a zealous partisan for the doctrine of the casuists, would not perhaps have approved of these decisions, but he was not consulted. The greatest misfortune was that neither solitary Peckham nor its sterile neighbourhood presented any expedients either for the execution of the aforementioned design, or for the relief of poor Mrs. Wetenhall. She was visibly pining away, when through fear of dying either with solitude or of want she had recourse to Miss Hamilton's commiseration. Their first acquaintance was formed at Paris, whither Mr. Wetenhall had taken his wife half a year after they were married, on a journey thither to buy books. Miss Hamilton, who from that very time greatly pitied her, consented to pass some time in the country with her, in hopes by that visit to deliver her for a short time at least out of her captivity, which project succeeded according to her wish. The Chevalier de Grammont, being informed of the day on which they were to arrive, borne on the wings of love and impatience, had engaged George Hamilton to go with him and meet them some miles out of London. The equipage he had prepared for the purpose corresponded with his usual magnificence, and on such an occasion we may reasonably suppose he had not neglected his person. However, with all his impatience, he checked the ardour of the coachman through fear of accidents, rightly judging that upon a road prudence is preferable to eagerness. The ladies at length appeared, and Miss Hamilton, being in his eyes 10 or 12 times more handsome than before her departure from London, he would have purchased with his life so kind a reception as she gave her brother. Mrs. Wetenhall had her share of the praises which at this interview were liberally bestowed upon her beauty, for which her beauty was very thankful to those who did it so much honour. and as Hamilton regarded her with a tender attention, she regarded Hamilton as a man very well qualified for putting in execution the little projects she had concerted with her conscience. As soon as she was in London, her head was almost turned through an excess of contentment and felicity. Everything appeared like enchantment to her in this superb city, more particularly, as in Paris, she had never seen anything farther than the Rue Saint-Jacques, and a few booksellers' shops. Miss Hamilton entertained her at her own house, and she was presented, admired, and well received at both courts. The Chevalier de Grammont, whose gallantry and magnificence were inexhaustible, taking occasion from this fair stranger's arrival to exhibit his grandeur, nothing was to be seen but balls, concerts, plays, excursions by land and by water, splendid collations, and sumptuous entertainments. Mrs. Wettenhall was transported with pleasures of which the greatest part were entirely new to her. She was greatly delighted with all except now and then at a play when tragedy was acted, which she confessed she thought rather wearisome. She agreed, however, that the show was very interesting when there were many people killed upon the stage, but thought the players were very fine, handsome fellows, who were much better alive than dead. Hamilton, upon the whole, was pretty well treated by her, if a man in love who is never satisfied until the completion of his wishes could confine himself within the bounds of moderation and reason. He used all his endeavours to determine her to put in execution the projects she had formed at Peckham. Mrs. Wettenhall, on the other hand, was much pleased with him. This is the Hamilton who served in the French army with distinction. He was both agreeable and handsome. All imaginable opportunities conspired to favour the establishment of an intimacy whose commencement had been so brisk that in all probability it would not languish for a conclusion. But the more he pressed her to it, the more her resolution began to fail, and regard for some scruples, which she had not well weighed, kept her in suspense. There was reason to believe that a little perseverance would have removed these obstacles, yet this at the present time was not attempted. Hamilton, not able to conceive what could prevent her from completing his happiness, since, in his opinion, the first and greatest difficulties of an amour were already overcome with respect to the public, resolved to abandon her to her irresolutions, instead of endeavouring to conquer them by a more vigorous attack. It was not consistent with reason to desist from an enterprise where so many prospects of success presented themselves for such inconsiderable obstacles. But he suffered himself to be intoxicated with chimeras and visions, which unseasonably cooled the vigour of his pursuit, and led him astray in another unprofitable undertaking. I apprehend he is the same George Hamilton already described, who married Miss Jennings, and not the author of this work, as Lord Orford supposes in a letter from Arlington to Sir William Godolphin, dated September 7, 1671. It is said the Conde de Molina complains to us of certain levies Sir George Hamilton hath made in Ireland. The king hath always told him he had no express licence for it, and I have told the Conde he must not find it strange that a gentleman who had been bred the king's page abroad, and losing his employment at home for being a Roman Catholic, should have some more than ordinary connivance towards the making his fortune abroad by the countenance of his friends and relations in Ireland. And yet, take the matter in the worst sense he could give it, would not amount to the breach of any article betwixt the king my master and the court of Spain. Arlington's letters Vol. Roman 2 p. 332, in a letter from the same nobleman to Lord Sandwich written about October 1667, we find the cause of Sir George Hamilton's entering into the French service. Concerning the reformados of the Guards of Horse, His Majesty thought fit the other day to have them dismissed according to his promise made to the Parliament at the last session. Mr. Hamilton had a secret overture made him that he with those men should be welcome into the French service. His Majesty at their dismissal, having declared they should have leave to go abroad whither they pleased, they accepted of Mr. Hamilton's offer to carry them into France. Arlington's letters Vol. Roman 1 p. 185. Large in his Peerage of Ireland, says Sir George Hamilton died in 1667, which from the first extract above appears to be erroneous. He has evidently confounded the father and son, the former of whom was the person who died in 1667. I know not whether poor Wettenhall took the blame upon herself, but it is certain she was extremely mortified upon it. Soon after being obliged to return to her cabbages and turkeys at Peckham, she had almost gone distracted. That residence appeared 1,000 times more dreadful to her since she had been initiated into the amusements of London. But as the Queen was to set out within a month for Tunbridge Wells, she was obliged to yield to necessity and return to the philosopher Wettenhall, with the consolation of having engaged Miss Hamilton to come and live at her house, which was within 10 or 12 miles of Tunbridge, as long as the court remained there. Miss Hamilton promised not to abandon her in her retirement, and further engaged to bring the Chevalier de Grammont along with her, whose humour and conversation extremely delighted her. The Chevalier de Grammont, who on all occasions started agreeable raillery, engaged on his part to bring George Hamilton, which words overwhelmed her with blushes. The court set out soon after to pass about 2 months in the place of all Europe, the most rural and simple, and yet at the same time the most entertaining and agreeable. Tunbridge is the same distance from London that Fontainebleau is from Paris, and is at the season the general rendezvous of all the gay and handsome of both sexes. The company, though always numerous, is always select, since those who repair thither for diversion ever exceed the number of those who go thither for health. Everything there breathes mirth, and pleasure. Constraint is banished, familiarity is established upon the first acquaintance, and joy and pleasure are the sole sovereigns of the place. The company are accommodated with lodgings in little clean and convenient habitations that lie straggling and separated from each other 1.5 miles all round the wells, where the company meet in the morning. This place consists of a long walk shaded by spreading trees, under which they walk while they are drinking the waters. On one side of this walk is a long row of shops plentifully stocked with all manner of toys, lace, gloves, stockings, and where there is raffling as at Paris in the Foire de Saint-Germain. On the other side of the walk is the market, and as it is the custom here for every person to buy their own provisions, care is taken that nothing offensive appears on the stalls here. Young, fair, fresh-coloured country girls, with clean linen, small straw hats, and neat shoes and stockings, sell game, vegetables, flowers, and fruit. Here one may live as one pleases. Here is likewise deep play, and no want of amorous intrigues. As soon as the evening comes, every one quits his little palace to assemble at the bowling green, where in the open air those who choose dance upon a turf, more soft and smooth than the finest carpet in the world. Lord Muskerry had within 2 or 3 short miles of Tunbridge a very handsome seat called Summerhill. Miss Hamilton, after having spent 8 or 10 days at Peckham, could not excuse herself from passing the remainder of the season at his house, and having obtained leave of Mr. Wettenhall that his lady should accompany her, they left the melancholy residence of Peckham and its tiresome master, and fixed their little court at Summer. They went every day to court, or the court came to them. The Queen even surpassed her usual attentions in inventing and supporting entertainments. She endeavoured to increase the natural ease and freedom of Tunbridge by dispensing with rather than requiring those ceremonies that were due to her presence, and confining in the bottom of her heart that grief and uneasiness she could not overcome. She saw Miss Stuart triumphantly possess the affections of the king, without manifesting the least uneasiness. Never did love see his empire in a more flourishing condition than on this spot. Those who were smitten before they came to it felt a mighty augmentation of their flame, and those who seemed the least susceptible of love laid aside their natural ferocity to act in a new character. For the truth of the latter, we shall only relate the change which soon appeared in the conduct of Prince Rupert. Lord Orford's contrast to this character of Prince Rupert is too just to be here omitted. Born with the taste of an uncle whom his sword was not fortunate in defending, Prince Rupert was fond of those sciences which soften and adorn a hero's private hours, and knew how to mix them with his minutes of amusement without dedicating his life to their pursuit, like us who, wanting capacity for momentous views, make serious study of what is only the transitory occupation of a genius. Had the court of the first Charles been peaceful, how agreeably had the prince's congenial propensity flattered and confirmed the inclination of his uncle. How the muse of arts would have repaid the patronage of the monarch, when for his first artist she would have presented him with his nephew. How different a figure did the same prince make an array of dissimilar complexion. The philosophically warrior, who could relax himself into the ornament of a refined court, was thought a savage mechanic when courtiers were only voluptuous wits. Let me transcribe a picture of Prince Rupert, drawn by a man who was far from having the least portion of wit in that age, who was superior to its indelicacy, and who yet was so overborne by its prejudices that he had the complacence to ridicule virtue, merit, talents. But Prince Rupert, alas, was an awkward lover. Lord Orford here inserts the character in the text, and then adds, what pity that we who wish to transmit this prince's resemblance to posterity on a fairer canvas have none of these inimitable colours to efface the harsher likeness. We can but oppose facts to wit, truth to satire. How unequal the pencils, yet what these lines cannot do they may suggest. They may induce the reader to reflect that if the prince was defective in the transient varnish of a court, he at least was adorned by the arts with that polish which alone can make a court attract the attention of subsequent ages. Catalogue of Engravers, p. 135 8 vo ed. He was brave and courageous even to rashness, but cross-grained and incorrigibly obstinate. His genius was fertile in mathematical experiments, and he possessed some knowledge of chemistry. He was polite even to excess unseasonably, but haughty and even brutal when he ought to have been gentle and courteous. He was tall and his manners were ungracious. He had a dry, hard-favoured visage and a stern look, even when he wished to please, but when he was out of humour he was the true picture of reproof. The Queen had sent for the players either that there might be no intermission in the diversions of the place, or perhaps to retort upon Miss Stuart. By the presence of Nell Gwynn, part of the uneasiness she felt from hers Prince Rupert found charms in the person of another player called Hughes, who brought down and greatly subdued his natural fierceness. Mrs. Hughes was one of the actresses belonging to the King's company, and one of the earliest female performers according to Downes. She commenced her theatrical career after the opening of Drury Lane Theatre in 1663. She appears to have been the first female representative of Desdemona by Prince Rupert. She had a daughter named Ruperta, married to Lieutenant General Howe, who survived her husband many years, dying at Somerset House about the year 1740. From this time adieu alembics, crucibles, furnaces, and all the black furniture of the forges, a complete farewell to all mathematical instruments and chemical speculations. Sweet powder and essences were now the only ingredients that occupied any share of his attention. The impertinent gypsy chose to be attacked in form and proudly refusing money, that in the end she might sell her favours at a dearer rate. She caused the poor prince to act a part so unnatural that he no longer appeared like the same person. The king was greatly pleased with this event, for which great rejoicings were made at Tunbridge, but nobody was bold enough to make it the subject of satire, though the same constraint was not observed with other ridiculous personages. There was dancing every day at the Queen's apartments, because the physicians recommended it, and no person thought it amiss, for even those who cared least for it chose that exercise to digest the waters, rather than walking. Lord Muskerry thought himself secure against his lady's rage for dancing, for although he was ashamed of it, the Princess of Babylon was by the grace of God 6 or 7 months advanced in pregnancy, and to complete her misfortune, the child had fallen all on one side, so that even Euclid would have been puzzled to say what her figure was. The disconsolate lady, seeing Miss Hamilton and Mrs. Wetenhall set out every morning, sometimes on horseback and sometimes in a coach, but ever attended by a gallant troop, to conduct them to court and to convey them back, she fancied 1,000 times more delights at Tunbridge than in reality there were, and she did not cease in her imagination to dance over at Summerhill all the country dances which she thought had been danced at Tunbridge. She could no longer support the racking torments which disturbed her mind, when relenting Heaven, out of pity to her pains and sufferings, caused Lord Muskerry to repair to London, and kept him there 2 whole days. As soon as ever he had turned his back, the Babylonian princess declared her resolution to make a trip to court. She had a domestic chaplain who did not want sense, and Lord Muskerry, for fear of accidents, had recommended her to the wholesome counsels and good prayers of this prudent divine. But in vain were all his preachings and exhortations to stay at home. In vain did he set before her eyes her husband's commands and the dangers to which she would expose herself in her present condition. He likewise added that her pregnancy being a particular blessing from heaven, she ought therefore to be so much the more careful for its preservation, since it cost her husband perhaps more trouble than she was aware of to obtain it. These remonstrances were altogether ineffectual. Miss Hamilton and her cousin Wetenhall having the complaisance to confirm her in her resolution, they assisted in dressing her the next morning, and set out along with her. All their skill and dexterity were requisite to reduce her shape into some kind of symmetry, but having at last pinned a small cushion under her petticoat on the right side, to counteract the untoward appearance the little infant occasioned by throwing itself on the left, they almost split their sides with laughter, assuring her at the same time that she looked perfectly charming. As soon as she appeared, it was generally believed that she had dressed herself in a farthingale in order to make her court to the Queen, but every person was pleased at her arrival. Those who were unacquainted with the circumstances assured her in earnest that she was pregnant with twins, and the Queen, who envied her condition, notwithstanding the ridiculous appearance she then made, being made acquainted with the motive of her journey, was determined to gratify her inclinations. As soon as the hour for country dances arrived, her cousin Hamilton was appointed her partner. she made some faint excuses at first on account of the inconvenient situation she was then in, but soon suffered them to be overcome in order, as she said, to show her duty to the Queen, and never did a woman in this world enjoy such complete satisfaction. We have already observed that the greatest prosperity is liable to the greatest change. Lady Muskerry trussed up, as she was seemed to feel no manner of uneasiness from the motion, in dancing on the contrary, being only apprehensive of the presence of her husband, which would have destroyed all her happiness. She danced with uncommon briskness, lest her ill stars should bring him back before she had fully satisfied herself with it. In the midst therefore of her capering in this indiscreet manner, her cushion came loose without her perceiving it, and fell to the ground in the very middle of the first round. The Duke of Buckingham, who watched her, took it up instantly, wrapped it up in his coat, and mimicking the cries of a newborn infant, he went about inquiring for a nurse for the young Muskerry among the maids of honour. This buffoonery, joined to the strange figure of the poor lady, had almost thrown Miss Stuart into hysterics, for the Princess of Babylon, after this accident, was quite flat on one side, and immoderately protuberant on the other. All those who had before suppressed their inclinations to laugh now gave themselves free scope when they saw that Miss Stuart was ready to split her sides. The poor lady was greatly disconcerted. Every person was officious to console her, but the Queen, who inwardly laughed more heartily than any, pretended to disapprove of their taking such liberties. Whilst Miss Hamilton and Mrs. Wetenhall endeavoured to refit Lady Muskerry in another room, the Duke of Buckingham told the King that if the physicians would permit a little exercise immediately after a delivery, the best way to recover Lady Muskerry was to renew the dance as soon as ever her infant was replaced. This advice was approved, and accordingly put in execution. The Queen proposed as soon as she appeared a second round of contridances, and Lady Muskerry, accepting the offer, the remedy had its desired effect, and entirely removed every remembrance of her late mishap. Whilst these things were passing at the King's court, that of the Duke of York took a journey on the other side of London. The pretence of this journey was to visit the county whose name he bore, but love was the real motive. The Duchess, since her elevation, had conducted herself with such prudence and circumspection as could not be sufficiently admired. Such were her manners, and such the general estimation in which she was held, that she appeared to have found out the secret of pleasing everyone, a secret yet more rare than the grandeur to which she had been raised. But after having gained universal esteem, she was desirous of being more particularly beloved, or more properly speaking, malicious Cupid assaulted her heart in spite of the discretion, prudence, and reason with which she had fortified it. In vain had she said to herself 100 times that if the Duke had been so kind as to do her justice by falling in love with her, he had done her too much honour by making her his wife, that with respect to his inconstant disposition, which estranged him from her, she ought to bear it with patience, until it pleased Heaven to produce a change in his conduct, that the frailties on his part, which might to her appear injurious, would never justify in her the least deviation from her duty, and as resentment was still less allowable, she ought to endeavour to regain him by a conduct entirely opposite to his own. In vain was it, as we have said before, that she had long resisted love and his emissaries. By the help of these maxims, how solid soever reason, and however obstinate wisdom and virtue may be, there are yet certain attacks which tire by their length, and in the end subdue both reason and virtue itself. The Duchess of York was one of the highest feeders in England. As this was an unforbidden pleasure, she indulged herself in it as an indemnification for other self-denials. It was really an edifying sight to see her at table. The Duke, on the contrary, being incessantly in the hurry of new fancies, exhausted himself by his inconstancy, and was gradually wasting away, whilst the poor princess, gratifying her good appetite, grew so fat and plump that it was a blessing to see her. It is not easy to determine how long things would have continued in this situation, if love, who was resolved to have satisfaction for her late conduct so opposite to the former, had not employed artifice as well as force to disturb her repose. He at first let loose upon her resentment and jealousy, two mortal enemies to all tranquillity and happiness, a tall creature, pale-faced, and nothing but skin and bone, named Churchill, whom she had taken for a maid of honour, became the object of her jealousy, because she was then the object of the Duke's affection. The court was not able to comprehend how, after having been in love with Lady Chesterfield, Miss Hamilton, and Miss Jennings, he could have any inclination for such a creature, but they soon perceived that something more than unaccountable variety had a great share in effecting this conquest. Miss Arabella Churchill, daughter of Sir Winston Churchill of Wotton Basset in the county of Wilts, and sister to the celebrated John Duke of Marlborough, she was born 1648, The Duchess beheld with indignation a choice which seemed to debase her own merit in a much greater degree than any of the former, at the very instant that indignation and jealousy began to provoke her spleen. Perfidious Cupid threw in the way of her passions and resentments the amiable handsome Sidney, and whilst he kept her eyes fixed upon his personal perfections, diverted her attention from perceiving the deficiency of his mental accomplishments. She was wounded before she was aware of her danger, but the good opinion Sidney had of his own merit did not suffer him long to be ignorant of such a glorious conquest, and in order more effectually to secure it, his eyes rashly answered everything which those of Her Royal Highness had the kindness to tell him, whilst his personal accomplishments were carefully heightened by all the advantages of dress and show. The Duchess, foreseeing the consequences of such an engagement, strongly combated the inclination that hurried her away, but Miss Hobart, siding with that inclination, argued the matter with her scruples, and in the end really vanquished them. This girl had insinuated herself into Her Royal Highness' confidence by a fund of news with which she was provided the whole year round the court, and the city supplied her, nor was it very material to her whether her stories were true or false, her chief care being that they should prove agreeable to her mistress. She knew likewise how to gratify her palate, and constantly provided a variety of those dishes and liquors which she liked best. These qualifications had rendered her necessary, but desirous of being still more so, and having perceived both the airs that Sidney gave himself and what was passing in the heart of her mistress, the cunning Hobart took the liberty of telling Her Royal Highness that this unfortunate youth was pining away solely on her account, that it was 1,000 pities a man of his figure should lose the respect for her, which was most certainly her due, merely because she had reduced him to such a state that he could no longer preserve it, that he was gradually dying away on her account in the sight of the whole court, that his situation would soon be generally remarked, except she made use of the proper means to prevent it, that in her opinion Her Royal Highness ought to pity the miserable situation into which her charms had reduced him, and to endeavour to alleviate his pain in some way or other. The Duchess asked her what she meant by endeavouring to alleviate his pain in some way or other. I mean, madam, answered Miss Hobart, that if either his person be disagreeable, or his passion troublesome, you will give him his discharge, or if you choose to retain him in your service, as all the princesses in the world would do in your place, you will permit me to give him directions from you for his future conduct, mixed with a few grains of hope, to prevent his entirely losing his senses, until you find a proper occasion yourself to acquaint him with your wishes. What, said the Duchess, would you advise me, Hobart, you, who really love me, to engage in an affair of this nature at the expense of my honour, and the hazard of 1,000 inconveniences? If such frailties are sometimes excusable, they certainly are not so in the high station in which I am placed, and it would be an ill requital on my part for his goodness who raised me to the rank I now fill. To all this is very fine, interrupted Miss Hobart, but is it not very well known that he only married you because he was importuned so to do, since that I refer to yourself, whether he has ever restrained his inclination a single moment, giving you the most convincing proofs of the change that has taken place in his heart, by 1,000 provoking infidelities? Is it still your intention to persevere in a state of indolence and humility, whilst the Duke, after having received the favours, or suffered the repulses of all the coquettes in England, pays his addresses to the maids of honour one after the other, and at present places his whole ambition and desires in the conquest of that ugly skeleton Churchill? What, madam, must then your prime of life be spent in a sort of widowhood, in deploring your misfortunes, without ever being permitted to make use of any remedy that may offer? A woman must be endowed with insuperable patience, or with an inexhaustible degree of resignation, to bear this. Can a husband who disregards you both night and day really suppose, because his wife eats and drinks heartily, as God be thanked your Royal Highness does, that she wants nothing else than to sleep well? To faith, such conduct is too bad. I therefore once more repeat that there is not a princess in the universe who would refuse the homage of a man like Sidney, when a husband pays his addresses elsewhere. These reasons were certainly not morally good, but had they been still worse, the Duchess would have yielded to them, so much did her heart act in concert with Miss Hobart to overthrow her discretion and prudence. This intrigue began at the very time that Miss Hobart advised Miss Temple not to give any encouragement to the addresses of the handsome Sidney. As for him, no sooner was he informed by the confidant Hobart that the goddess accepted his adoration, than he immediately began to be particularly reserved and circumspect in his behaviour, in order to divert the attention of the public. But the public is not so easily deceived as some people imagine. As there were too many spies, too many inquisitive people and critics in a numerous court, residing in the midst of a populous city, The Duchess, to avoid exposing the inclinations of her heart to the scrutiny of so many inquisitors, engaged the Duke of York to undertake the journey before mentioned, whilst the Queen and her court were at Tunbridge. This conduct was prudent, and if agreeable to her was far from displeasing to any of her court. Except Miss Jennings, Jermyn was not of the party, and in her opinion every party was insipid in which he was not one of the company. He had engaged himself in an enterprise above his strength in laying a wager which the Chevalier de Grammont had laid before, and lost. He betted 500 guineas that he would ride 20 miles in 1 hour upon the same horse in the high road. The day he had fixed upon for this race was the very same in which Miss Jennings went to the fortune-tellers. Jermyn was more fortunate than her in this undertaking. He came off victorious, but as his courage had far exceeded the strength of his constitution in this exertion to win the wager, he got a violent fever into the bargain, which brought him very low. Miss Jennings inquired after his health, but that was all she dared to do in modern romances. A princess need only pay a visit to some hero abandoned by his physicians. A perfect cure would be wrought in 3 days. But since Miss Jennings had not been the cause of Jermyn's fever, she was not certain of relieving him from it, although she had been sure that a charitable visit would not have been censured in a malicious court, without therefore paying any attention to the uneasiness she might feel upon the occasion. The court set out without him. She had, however, the gratification to testify her ill humour throughout the whole journey, by appearing displeased with everything which seemed to afford satisfaction to all the rest of the company. Talbot made one of the company, and flattering himself that the absence of a dangerous rival might produce some change in his favour, he was attentive to all the actions, motions, and even gestures of his former mistress. There was certainly enough fully to employ his attention. It was contrary to her disposition to remain long in a serious humour. Her natural vivacity hurried her away from being seemingly lost in thought into sallies of wit, which afforded him hopes that she would soon forget Jermyn, and remember that his own passion was the first she had encouraged. However, he kept his distance notwithstanding his love, and his hopes being of opinion that it ill became an injured lover to betray either the least weakness or the smallest return of affection for an ungrateful mistress who had deserted him. Miss Jennings was so far from thinking of his resentments that she did not even recollect he had ever paid his addresses to her, and her thoughts being wholly occupied upon the poor sick man, she conducted herself towards Talbot as if they never had had anything to say to each other. It was to him that she most usually gave her hand either in getting into or out of the coach. She conversed more readily with him than any other person, and without intending it did everything to make the court believe she was cured of her passion for Jermyn in favour of her former lover. Of this he seemed likewise convinced as well as the rest, and thinking it now proper to act another part, in order to let her know that his sentiments with respect to her were still the same, he had resolved to address her in the most tender and affectionate manner upon this subject. Fortune seemed to have favoured him, and to have smoothed the way for this intended harangue. He was alone with her in her chamber, and what was still better, she was rallying him concerning Miss Boynton, saying that they were undoubtedly much obliged to him for attending them on their journey, whilst poor Miss Boynton had fainting fits at Tunbridge at least twice every day for love of him. Upon this discourse, Talbot thought it right to begin the recital of his sufferings and fidelity, when Miss Temple, with a paper in her hand, entered the room. This was a letter in verse which Lord Rochester had written some time before upon the intrigues of the 2 courts, wherein upon the subject of Miss Jennings he said that Talbot had struck terror among the people of God by his gigantic stature, but that Jermyn, like a little David, had vanquished the great Goliath. Jennings, delighted with this allusion, read it over 2 or 3 times, thought it more entertaining than Talbot's conversation, at first heartily laughed at it, but soon after with a tender poor little David," said she with a deep sigh, and turning her head on one side during this short reverie, she shed a few tears which assuredly did not flow for the defeat of the giant. This stung Talbot to the quick, and seeing himself so ridiculously deceived in his hopes, he went abruptly out of the room, vowing never to think any more of a giddy girl whose conduct was regulated neither by sense nor reason. But he did not keep his resolution. The other votaries of love, who were numerous in this court, were more successful, the journey being undertaken solely on that account. There were continual balls and entertainments upon the road, hunting, and all other diversions wherever the court halted in its progress. The tender lovers flattered themselves with the thought of being able to crown their happiness as they proceeded in their journey, and the beauties who governed their destiny did not forbid them to hope. Sidney paid his court with wonderful assiduity. The Duchess made the Duke take notice of his late perfect devotion to his service. His Royal Highness observed it, and agreed that he ought to be remembered upon the first opportunity, which happened soon after. Montagu, as before mentioned, was master of the horse to the Duchess. He was possessed of a great deal of wit, had much penetration, and loved mischief. How could she bear such a man near her person, in the present situation of her heart? This greatly embarrassed her, but Montagu's elder brother, having very apropos got himself killed where he had no business, the Duke obtained for Montagu the post of master of the horse to the Queen, which the deceased enjoyed, and the handsome Sidney was appointed to succeed him in the same employment to the Duchess. All this happened according to her wish, and the Duke was highly pleased that he had found means to promote these two gentlemen at once, without being at the least expense. Miss Hobart greatly applauded these promotions. She had frequent and long conversations with Sidney, which being remarked, some did her the honour to believe it was upon her own account, and the compliments that were made her upon the occasion she most willingly received. The Duke, who believed it, at first observed to the Duchess the unaccountable taste of certain persons, and how the handsomest young fellow in England was infatuated with such a frightful creature. The Duchess confessed that taste was very arbitrary, the truth whereof he himself seemed to be convinced of, since he had fixed upon the beauteous Helen for his mistress. I know not whether this raillery caused him to reflect for what reasons he had made his choice, but it is certain he began to cool in his affections for Miss Churchill, and perhaps he would entirely have abandoned this pursuit, had not an accident taken place which raised in him an entirely new inclination for her. The court having halted for a few days in a fine open country, the Duchess was desirous of seeing a greyhound course. This diversion is practised in England upon large downs, where the turf eaten by the sheep is particularly green and wonderfully. Even she was in her coach, and all the ladies on horseback, every one of them being attended by her squire. It therefore was but reasonable that the mistress should likewise have her squire. He accordingly was at the side of her coach, and seemed to compensate for his deficiencies in conversation by the uncommon beauty of his mien and figure. The Duke attended Miss Churchill, not for the sake of besieging her with soft, flattering tales of love, but on the contrary to chide her for sitting so ill on horseback. She was one of the most indolent creatures in the world, and although the maids of honour are generally the worst mounted of the whole court, yet in order to distinguish her on account of the favour she enjoyed, they had given her a very pretty, though rather a high-spirited horse, a distinction she would very willingly have excused them. The embarrassment and fear she was under had added to her natural paleness in this situation. Her countenance had almost completed the Duke's disgust when her horse, desirous of keeping pace with the others, set off in a gallop, notwithstanding her greatest efforts to prevent it and her endeavours to hold him in firing his mettle. He at length set off at full speed, as if he was running a race against the Duke's horse. Miss Churchill lost her seat, screamed out, and fell from her horse. A fall in so quick a pace must have been violent, and yet it proved favourable to her in every respect, for without receiving any hurt, she gave the lie to all the unfavourable suppositions that had been formed of her person. In judging from her face, the Duke alighted in order to help her. She was so greatly stunned that her thoughts were otherwise employed than about decency on the present occasion, and those who first crowded around her found her rather in a negligent posture. They could hardly believe that limbs of such exquisite beauty could belong to Miss Churchill's face. After this accident, it was remarked that the Duke's tenderness and affection for her increased every day, and towards the end of the winter it appeared that she had not tyrannized over his passion, nor made him languish with impatience. The two courts returned to London much about the same time, equally satisfied with their respective excursions, though the Queen was disappointed in the hopes she had entertained of the good effects of the Tunbridge waters. It was about this time that the Chevalier de Grammont received a letter from the Marchioness de St. Chaumont, his sister, acquainting him that he might return when he thought proper. The King having given him leave, he would have received this news with joy at any other time, whatever had been the charms of the English court. But in the present situation of his heart, he could not resolve to quit it. He had returned from Tunbridge 1,000 times deeper in love than ever, for during this agreeable excursion he had every day seen Miss Hamilton, either in the marshes of melancholy Peckham, or in the delicious walks of cheerful Summerhill, or in the daily diversions and entertainments of the Queen's court, and whether he saw her on horseback, heard her conversation, or observed her in the dance, still he was persuaded that heaven had never formed an object in every respect more worthy of the love and more deserving of the affection of a man of sense and delicacy. How then was it possible for him to bear the thoughts of leaving her? This appeared to him absolutely impracticable. However, as he was desirous of making a merit with her of the determination he had made to neglect his fortune rather than to be separated from her charms, he showed her his sister's letter, but this confidence had not the success he expected. Miss Hamilton, in the first place, congratulated him upon his recall. She returned him many thanks for the sacrifice he intended to make her, but as this testimony of affection greatly exceeded the bounds of mere gallantry, however sensibly she might feel this mark of his tenderness, she was however determined not to abuse it in vain. Did he protest that he would rather meet death than part from her irresistible charms, and her irresistible charms protested that he should never see them more unless he departed immediately. Thus was he forced to obey. However, he was allowed to flatter himself that these positive orders, how harsh soever they might appear, did not flow from indifference, that she would always be more pleased with his return than with his departure, for which she was now so urgent, and having generously given him assurances that so far as depended upon herself, he would find upon his return no variation in her sentiments during his absence, he took leave of his friends, thinking of nothing but his return at the very time he was making preparations for his departure.